We'd indicated in our blood pressure and cardiac output sections that one of the avenues in which we can have a change in fluid volume is going to be at the capillary. We mentioned fluid loss at the kidney. Of course, we can take fluid from the blood and put it into the urine in order to get rid of waste products. And we can retain or lose various amounts of that fluid. But we also have a constant transition of fluid into and out of the tissues through the capillary. We discussed a vascular bed. We had the arterial blood flowing into a capillary, and at the other end of the capillary is the venous blood. Oxygenated blood flows into the capillary carrying nutrients. We are going to generally get fluid leave that capillary, go out into the tissues to provide the cells that are going to sit out here. Or when I say capillary, this is the capillary, this blood vessel. Out here would be the interstitial fluid and the tissues. So we're going to get fluid enter the capillary from the arterial side, leave the capillary carrying with it oxygen, nutrients, electrolytes, whatever the cells that are sitting out here in the tissues would need. And that fluid is then going to shift back into the capillary, carrying with it now carbon dioxide and waste products that were produced from the tissues. So we get this bidirectional movement of fluid. This bidirectional movement is going to be dictated by two particular forces that we see available. One is blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force that pushes fluid out of a capillary. Blood pressure pushes fluid out of a capillary. The other force is osmotic pressure. Now, if you're not familiar with the term osmosis, please go look in your textbook. There's going to be a section there in your membrane transport regarding osmosis. Osmosis is going to be the movement of a solvent in the direction of a hypertonic solution. So in this case, we wind up seeing osmotic pressure become the force that will eventually drag fluid from the tissues and back into the capillary. So blood pressure pushing fluid out, osmotic pressure pulling fluid back in. Now I will try and post a separate video on osmosis. That's not going to be relevant now, but it's okay if you need the background information. So what I like to do when I'm describing how these two forces balance over the length of that capillary is that I like to break it down and simplify the problem a little bit. I like to divide the capillary up into segments. Now, of course, in real life, this is not really how that system is going to work, but by doing it this way, it will give you something you can visualize to help you better understand how this Starling-Landis fluid shift occurs. So blood pressure pushes fluid out, osmotic pressure pulls it back in, and by that way, we hope to maintain a constant flow or volume of blood inside that vascular system. It's important to look at each particular segment and see which of our two forces is the strongest. Blood pressure pushing fluid out, osmotic pressure pushing fluid in. Whichever force is stronger is going to win, and that's going to be the net directional movement of that fluid. So again, we take it one segment at a time. Segment one. We know that blood pressure drops as we go from the arterial side to the venous side. So we would expect blood pressure to be at its highest on the arterial side of a capillary and only drop off and become lower as we move from left to right across this diagram. The osmotic pressure is going to be created by a protein called albumin. Albumin sits in the blood and it cannot pass through the capillary wall. And of course, that is going to be the magic scenario we need in order for osmosis to take place. A solute on one side of a membrane, the membrane be impermeable to that solute, and now we will get fluid shift in the direction of whichever side of the membrane becomes hypertonic. So as we start off in the first segment, blood pressure is high. That is going to be our highest force at that point. It's going to push fluid out. Now we're going to start to be able to see the trend happening. As we move from left to right, blood pressure drops down. We just went through segment 1 and we lost some fluid, but the albumin stays in the capillary. The solute stays in the capillary. So now as we move to the second segment of the capillary, what has happened to the osmotic pressure as we moved from segment 1 to segment 2? All we lost here so far was the fluid. The albumin stays behind. So the albumin's gotten more concentrated as we've gone from segment 1 to segment 2. If it's gotten more concentrated, that means the osmotic pressure has gone up. However, in segment 2, blood pressure has also gone down. So you can see how we're closing the gap now. Blood pressure pushes fluid out, osmotic pressure pulls it back in. As we go from segment 1 to segment 2, blood pressure has gone down a little bit. And because all we've lost is the fluid, osmotic pressure has gone up. However, in segment 2, blood pressure is still going to outweigh the osmotic pressure, so we still lose more fluid. Now as we go into chamber 3, segment 3, we see something dramatic has happened. Blood pressure, again, has gone down as we've gone from segment 2 to segment 3, because blood pressure drops down as we go from left to right in general. As we go from 2 to 3, we've lost more fluid. Therefore, the albumin inside segment 2 now becomes even more concentrated, increasing the osmotic pressure again. So now in segment 3, blood pressure has dropped down even more, osmotic pressure has gone up even more, and that's when the osmotic pressure overtakes it. Now, the osmotic pressure is stronger than the blood pressure, and we're going to see fluid re-enter that capillary. Keep in mind that at this line here would have been that hypothetical midpoint where blood pressure and osmotic pressure were equal forces. Therefore, you got this hypothetical midline where no fluid shift would occur at all. So the fluid re-enters segment 3, dilutes some of the fluid in here. Bringing more fluid in now raises osmotic pressure as we go from 3 to 4. But blood pressure dropped even more again. So in spite of the osmotic pressure going down now, blood pressure also went down. Once we cross that hypothetical midpoint, the osmotic pressure stays above the blood pressure. And hopefully when all is said and done, the amount of fluid we lost on the arterial side is going to be equal to the amount of fluid that we gained back on the venous side. Now this is never going to be 100%. We're always going to have some excess fluid enter the tissues that never comes back in this means. And we'll address that once we talk about the lymphatic system. You will see through diagrams in the textbook that you'll often see an increased arrow on the blood pressure at this point and a decreased arrow over here. You will also see things like a decreased osmotic pressure there and an increased osmotic pressure here. I want to make sure we put this in context because this is very misleading. These arrows are not meant to necessarily compare any particular pair of variables. More so, when you see the blood pressure arrows increased and decreased, we are comparing blood pressure from left to right. Those two arrows are meant to imply that the blood pressure on the arterial side is higher than the blood pressure on the venous side. When we look at the arrows next to the osmotic pressure, they're meant to compare directly to the blood pressure at the same site. So at this point, the osmotic pressure is low, the blood pressure is high. But at this point, the osmotic pressure is higher than the blood pressure. And we know this is true, and comparing it any other way doesn't make sense, because the osmotic pressure here and the osmotic pressure here should be the same. If we lost equal amounts of fluid into and out of that capillary, the osmotic pressure on the arterial side should equal the osmotic pressure on the venous side. Blood pressure drops down from left to right. If we were to graph pressure for blood pressure drops off from left to right. However, the osmotic pressure increases. The osmotic pressure increases as we go through the first half of the capillary. But as we cross that midline, we'll see it drop back down as fluid is brought back into the capillary. So when all is said and done, the osmotic pressure at the venous end is the same as the osmotic pressure on the arterial end. Now, we will see certain scenarios where we get an imbalance in this fluid shift. And generally speaking, it's going to be an excess of fluid leaving the capillary and accumulating into the tissues. We call this edema. And we're going to see a couple of scenarios that would take the variables that we have here right now and change them in such a way that we wind up getting more fluid leave the capillary than we can bring back in. The first, hypertension. If someone has a hypertensive state chronically, we still have the exact same mechanism that occurs. But picture the blood pressure going in to the capillary is going to be elevated. So we can take this entire line and raise it up. And by doing so, we can still witness blood pressure drop from left to right, but the average blood pressure is going to be higher. So now, osmotic pressure can still overtake that blood pressure, but if we want to draw our hypothetical midpoint again, it's going to be further up the capillary. In a practical sense, now we have more capillary dedicated to fluid loss than we do to fluid uptake, which is going to lead to an imbalance. So hypertension can cause a shift in the blood pressure, resulting in a fluid shift. The other thing that could cause edema is going to be a vascular block, a blood clot in a vein. We get a clot that may occur over here on the venous side, preventing blood from flowing through in that direction. What's going to happen to pressure backwards at the capillary? A blockage downstream causes a bit of a backlog, and pressure inside the capillary now will be higher than it normally would have been. In a sense, creating a localized hypertensive state. It's going to have the same effect, at least at that one location, that a hypertension had to begin with. So we can manipulate the blood pressure in those two ways. What about if we manipulate the albumin concentration? If we have a liver disease and we're not producing as much albumin, we're not going to be able to exert as much of an osmotic pressure. So even though we're losing fluid, the osmotic pressure, the concentration that we can achieve as we move from left to right initially, isn't going to have the same impact. The blood pressure is still going to be a constant, so we will still lose fluid, but without adequate albumin, we're not going to be able to generate adequate osmotic pressure in order to pull fluid back in, again creating an excess accumulation of fluid out in the tissues. And the last one, and probably the most notable reason that people would get edema, is through trauma. We rupture a blood vessel. One of the things we need for osmosis to take place is a selectively permeable membrane. We need to have a membrane that's intact, that's keeping certain solutes on one side and not allowing them to cross. If we rupture the capillary, or any blood vessel for that matter, we lose that selectively permeable membrane. Now, fluid rushes out of the capillary, bringing the albumin with it, because the membrane of the capillary is no longer able to keep the albumin contained inside the vascular system. Loss of albumin, loss of osmosis, therefore we lose the force that would cause fluid to go back into the capillary to begin with. So there are some notes posted on this particular section, but because there was more drawing to be involved, I got away from the classroom style video and just went with a whiteboard drawing. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and we will answer them as best we can. Take care.